I was curious about the Fabians, which is mostly why your podcast with Sean Atwood was very interesting to me, because I had heard you mention it before, but I didn't really take the time to look into it. As I said, I was on the road listening to your podcast, and then when I did look into it, it was very strange, the coincidence, because at the same time that the Sean Atwood video came out, I put out a video around about the same time talking about wolves in sheep's clothing.
Mm-hmm.
And I also have tattoos on my left ankle, which is a wolf on one side and a turtle on the other,
Oh,
which was very strange. And of course, the symbolism of the Fabians is the wolf in sheep's clothing and the tortoise.
yeah.
So
Yeah.
I thought that was very very odd. And
Well, why did you choose a wolf and a turtle?
so it was actually supposed to be a tortoise, but the design that I found for a tattoo ended up being a turtle.
Yeah.
And it was because years ago I did mediumship with a group of people, and those were two spirit animals that kind of appeared for me, and I never quite knew why. So I'm still not quite sure why, but yeah, I thought they were some kind of guide, and perhaps they are.
So, and you didn't know anything about the Fabian Society prior to the Sean Atwood thing?
No, I'd never heard of them, which is strange in and of itself, because they're actually quite open if you look into them. They're not
Yeah.
really hiding. They're not like a secret society. They're quite open about their political affiliations and who they are.
Yeah, it's true. But they do keep a low profile.
Yes, yeah. They're not vocal, but I know that like they've been on the ABC TV in Australia has a show called Q&A, and they've had people on their panel before who are from the Fabian Society, and
Mm-hmm.
of course they're generally associated with the Labor parties in both Australia and the UK. And
Yeah.
I have been a union, um, not a delegate, but yeah, I've done door knocking and things for the union before.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought I would pick your brain. You said you don't really have a lot to do with that side of your life anymore, because you generally purged a lot of your early childhood stuff into your books.
Well, I mean, there's two things, aren't there? Because my early childhood isn't really wrapped up with the Fabian Society in my own memory or anything. I just discovered that I was sort of embedded in that nexus. So what I was referring to more, although they are connected, was in terms of the information that is in my books. A lot of it, particularly in the Alcoholic Yorkshire Vice of Kings, I'd say, or particularly part one, was information that I was gathering on this trail to try and make sense of my own past. And so it was a means to an end. It was like a detective looking for clues, and then of course the clues don't really mean anything except in the context of the crime that he's trying to solve. So in my case, it was, it wasn't exactly a crime, but it was related to some criminal underworld or overworld in my own past. So I wasn't actually that interested in the Fabian Society, and in a way I'm still not. I mean, I do find it, their methodology is very interesting, this whole thing of permeating. infiltrating society in this fairly open way and influencing the influencers, and gradualism. And so there are things that I would say are generally interesting. But in terms of who they, who was a Fabian and when and where and all those dates and things, I suppose some of it I do retain, but I don't particularly want to. I mean, and so that was my real point there, was that I don't, because I have been interviewed about it, and sometimes I just draw blanks, and I've even been criticised for that. Like, who's this guy? He can't have written that book. He didn't even know how to answer the questions. So I just wanted to put that up front, that for me, the information in the books is really secondary, and particularly around that subject, like the other Prisoner of Infinity, less so because it's about Whitley Strieber, and I was really into Whitley Strieber for years before I wrote the book. So, whereas I've never been into the Fabian Society, or for that matter, British history. So I can read Vice of Kings now, and I'm still almost learning things, even though I wrote it. I'm like, oh God, that's really interesting, because I was just finding the facts that would help me to make it to the place I wanted to make it. And that is very much the process for me of writing the books. It's trying to make sense of my past and of the present, and it does seem to be related to resolving kind of unconscious tensions between my mind and my body that for whatever reason, I mean, why I became a writer, I don't, that's a bigger question, but for me, writing it, I think it's always been a therapeutic tool for me, a tool of self-discovery, and even of purging, as you use that term, purging.
Yeah, I find kind of the same thing as well when I write something or make a video, produce a piece of work. It's sort of like once you've got it out, your brain's like, okay, I don't need to retain that anymore, and it just like purges it. Because it's almost like you've spent the time sorting through all of the things, neatening it up into straight lines, making sense of it, and then formatting it into something that can be consumed by other people, and then you can just let it go.
There's an analogy actually I came up with in Prisoner of Infinity because it corresponded with my actually doing this, which is gold panning. And I mean, easy place to go to would be the actual act of gold panning. Most of it's black sand, and so of course you don't keep the black sand, but you do use the black sand. It is a clue that you're getting closer to the pastry, and so you keep panning. But essentially, if actually throwing it all away, you would even throw the gold away because there's so little of it, and the aim is actually to get to the pastry. So the panning, you're just looking at all that for evidence of how close you are to the pastry, but each time you're tossing it away. So that's very much, I think that's a good analogy here, as I've been trying to get to something that is hidden.
Yeah, it's something that doesn't really want to be found.
That too, yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And that's a recurring theme as well, is that because I'm writing with my conscious mind, in order to try and find something that's unconscious. And if it's unconscious, because my mind has decided, if you like, has configured itself in such a way to keep it unconscious. So I'm actually using the very tool that has covered it up to try and uncover it, which theoretically it's impossible. But I think there is a way it can happen. I think the mind can be tricked.
Yeah, well, the mind often protects itself from various different things and hides it under layers of the subconscious.
Mm-hmm.
So sifting through the subconscious to get to something that you can actually be consciously aware of can be quite a process.
And one of the things I do, and this is back to the clues, looking at information as clues rather than you know, as a, well, let's just say as clues, is looking for anomalies, looking for holes in the plot. So again, that would be the detective thing. He hears the stories and he thinks, wait a minute, last time that person said this, or this doesn't gel with what the other witness says. He's looking for the anomalies and the inconsistencies. So I do that with other people's stories, but I'm also doing it with my own. That's the thing. And also, I often refer to my previous writing as well. They're not so much in the Vice of Kings, but in Seen and Not Seen, and also this last one, because they're both about movies. I'm referring to my early writing because my first published writing was about movies, and there are things that I gave away that I didn't know I was giving away because I didn't know they were there.
Oh, okay, interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I was looking at some of your early stuff. I haven't, I must admit, I haven't had time to read through everything.
Yeah, sure. Expect that.
Yeah, you've written quite a few books.
Yeah.
How many is it now?
Well, it's too many is the short answer, and the reason I say it's too many is because, well, premature ejaculation just came to mind, uh, premature articulation, um, well, and that is not a bad analogy. I mean, one can end up having abortions or children that are unwanted, and so some of those books, those early books, well, I mean, it's a spectrum, but there are definitely some where I believed things that I shouldn't have believed, and I was propagating things that I would now say were very clearly were disinformation. I became an unwitting conveyor of disinformation, and not in any extreme way, although who knows, you know, only on Judgment Day, I guess we'll find out. But beyond that, they're quite sloppily written, and I just wasn't really as, I wasn't as clever as I thought I was, and I wasn't as rigorous as I thought I was. I mean, it's normal, I suppose.
Yeah, I think if you have a body of work, at some point you're going to find the holes in your own work after a while.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
I've definitely found that with my videos as well.
Well, sure. It's a little, well, I suppose it's all subjective, isn't it? But I mean, because I do videos and podcasts, and I consider them sort of disposable in a certain way, and they're raw anyway. They're supposed to be rough and raw, in my view, whereas books are supposed to be polished, and I thought they were polished, and they do sort of have a life. I guess they have a longer shelf life, the right term, isn't it? Bookshelf life.
Mm.
Um, but anyway, to maybe answer the question a bit more fully, I wrote 2 volumes to begin. I mean, my first published thing. Unfortunately, I couldn't get published for many years. Otherwise, I'd have, you know, made a bigger mess of things because I was ready to get published in my early 20s. I mean, I wanted to. I tried, but
Mm.
I was 30 before I published Blood Poets, and that was a huge 2 volume thing, like 1,000 pages worth of me gushing about movies, violence in movies. Definitely there's some insights. It's interesting to see. I had some, and some of the insights I didn't know, I really didn't know how deep they were. And then ones I thought were deep, they're just like, no, that's just wrong, you know. So, uh, and that was, and at that time I had this idea that I would be famous twice. It was to me it was important to be famous. Embarrassed to say, but that was part of my Fabian quote unquote programming or upbringing. It's very much about having influence, being a player in the cultural scene. I was indoctrinated with that, and I had this goal to make 2 names for myself. That one would be the movie writer, and I went by Jake then, so that was Jake Horsley, and I did get Blood Poets published, and that felt like that was happening. In the meantime, I had this other identity who was Jason Wind initially, and then he became Aeolus Cephas. And that was the occult guy and the conspiracy guy who writes about stuff that could get you in trouble, or at least you couldn't have a mainstream reputation if you wrote about this stuff back then. I mean, well, even now, I mean, David Icke, he's mainstream, but he's not really reputable. So I wanted to be reputable and do all this dark, forbidden stuff. So that was my goal. And so I published Blood Poets, and then about 4 years later, after Matrix Warrior, which was my my breakthrough, quote unquote, although it didn't break very much. As Jake, the movie guy, I published Lucid View as Aeolus Cephas, which was about conspiracies and UFOs and all that stuff. And it's actually the Aeolus Cephas stuff that I'm most ambivalent about now, because the movie stuff, it's kind of some of it's quite sloppily written, but it's relatively benign or harmless because it's just about movies, and it's not that deep analysis. It's more about me as a fan, a movie fan in those early books. I wanted to be the next Pauline Kael, essentially. If
Yeah,
you know who she is.
I don't. Sorry.
She was the film critic for The New Yorker, and she's an amazing writer. Just one of the best writers in the English language who happened to be a film critic.
Hmm. Yeah. No, it would be quite a sweet job to be a film critic, although depends on the film, I suppose.
Yeah, once upon a time it might have been. I don't think now it would be so sweet. And of course, now I see that whole thing as anything but harmless. The whole other thing.
Yeah, so it's not so much just the movies that you watch, it's also I guess the string pulling behind it, like what gets greenlit,
Yeah.
how it's supposed to be portrayed. It used to be, I don't know if you watch much Jordan Peterson or
I
anything
used
like
to.
that.
I mean, there was a period when I did. I
Yeah.
watched his Maps of Meaning lectures.
Yeah, so he talks about stories and archetypes and things like that, and they're supposed to have layers and layers of meaning that you can never really get to the bottom of, but it's supposed to tell you something about the culture that you live in, and about who you are as a human being. And there's a lot of movies now that are less about layers of meaning and more about just straight up propaganda.
Yeah.
And it's generally just very obvious now.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Straight.
I don't know if uh, you're writing 16 Maps of Hell, which is quite an interesting title.
Mm-hmm.
And I was reading the synopsis that you wrote on your website about it, that the number 16 actually is quite significant.
How so?
So related to like the number 4 in Chinese.
Yeah, death. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I did know before that number 4 is something that they're very superstitious about, but I didn't know why, that it's very similar to the word for death.
Yeah. Yeah. I hadn't thought of that. With 16. Maybe later it came up. I can't remember, but I think it did come up later. It did, didn't it? Because I blogged about it. But that was quite organic. That whole 16 business.
Hmm. Some people might say that 2016 was an interesting year, a bit of a shift in the landscape. But I don't know if you've ever heard of one of the things I've been researching lately is Frankism.
Frankism, yeah,
Mm.
but I don't know much about it. Just that it's popped up a bit recently.
Yeah. So there was a guy back in 1666 called Sabbatai Zevi.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mentioned him, and he came up in relation to Leonard Cohen, so that's how I know about it.
Yeah. He appointed himself the Messiah at the time. And so 2016 was technically the 250th anniversary of that. And it was interesting because in the Jewish tradition, if someone is a heretic, they're excommunicated up to the 10th generation. And so if every generation is roughly around 25 years, then that's roughly 250 years.
Oh, right. So that does make it a bit more significant, a bit less random, yeah.
And I I was curious about, you know, cycles of time, because I know that George Orwell named his book 1984 because that was the 100th year anniversary of the foundation of the Fabians.
Okay, well, that's news to me. There seem to be various versions around that, because the one I ended up here believing, I suppose, was the night that he wrote in 1948, and then he just flipped the numbers around.
Could be both, don't know. But yeah, no,
On either, yeah.
strange coincidence if it's not.
Yeah, no, I didn't. That's the first I heard of that. That's okay. So that's interesting. Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, so
Yeah. Well, here.
long game rather than short game.
Yeah. Absolutely. Um, and that is I mean, that's central to the philosophy of the Fabians, is this gradualism, the tortoise thing, sort of eroding, like the way erosion works. You could say eroding the culture. Well, they would see it more as building, of course, but you could look at it either way. And it's also, it overlaps with the trope that many people can be skeptical about of long-term, I prefer the term social engineering, but it does involve conspiring, it does involve men in rooms, and things that some people like to ridicule for some reason. They are, but then the much harder to find reputable sources on, which is the secret society elements. Now, secret society could mean many different things, but it has that general association with occult fraternities and rituals and so on. But anyway, I just mentioned it now in the context of Foucault's Pendulum is about this, actually, the Umberto Eco book. The very long-term plans that maybe unfold over hundreds of years, in centuries, and how difficult it is for people to believe that, or understand how it might work. And I think because we perhaps literalize it too much, or I mean, we've got a lot of narratives out there, including Hollywood movies, that frame those kind of things in this very uh, yeah, literalized or simplified way. So then it does become a little hard to believe. But what I mean, one of the ways I try and recontextualize that idea with the Vice of Kings is in terms of ideologies and methodologies and end goals. I mean, I do really, there is a lot of evidence that the Fabian Society were attempting to engineer a society along lines that we now see existing. So there definitely is that one can make that correlation. Well, look, they were talking about this kind of world, and look, now we have it. But how it happened is less well understood. And one of the ways I say to understand how it happened is seeding a culture with values.
Mm.
There's a quote at the beginning of the book, something like I think it was Victor Hugo, the quote, that an idea can do far more harm than any kind of weapon, something like that. I'm just paraphrasing, but essentially, yeah, if you can seed a society with values and ideologies, and that there are methods sort of come out of that. Like if a philosophy will lead to a methodology often, as in when you try to practice a certain philosophy, it just naturally leads to certain methodologies. So that seems to be, to me, that's much closer to how it is possible that we can have these long-term social engineering plots, to
Yeah.
rule the world.
Yeah.
And the real bottom line I find so fascinating is we become the implementers of the plot. We ourselves, whatever level.
It's sort of
We
like
know that.
we're the carriers.
Yeah, carriers of I don't want to use the term virus now because it's so loaded, but anyway, carriers of that thing that's contagious and that spreads. Yeah.
Yeah, it's an interesting idea. They kind of did that in the second season of Legion, where they had the thought as like this little bug that breaks out of an egg and it gets into your ear, and then it grows inside of you and becomes this monster.
Oh, I think they stole that from Snow Crash, Neil Stevenson. I bet he did. No, no one wanted that bad boy. Or maybe it was in the comic book, and it was
Oh
stolen
yeah,
that way.
true. Could have been in the comic.
Yeah.
I'm not quite sure because I don't know the actual comic series.
No, I don't know it either. But that's a great the Namchub they're called in the Neil Stevenson, and they're earworms, yeah. And it sounds very similar, but it's a very interesting thesis that Neil Stevenson had there. Yeah.
Yeah. So the idea of like seeding the culture with philosophy, I think a lot of people underestimate the role of philosophy in general. It's kind of seen as a very superfluous study.
Yeah.
But
Right. It's just philosophical, right?
yeah, there's no harm in an idea. Um, but yeah, there's a lot of, well, what I've noticed lately is there's a lot of nihilism
Mm.
in the culture, which is quite disturbing.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think nihilism is the soft side of Satanism. I mean, Satanism, of course, is a big loaded word, and it's been, of course, it gets associated with Christians and stuff, but the sense of being thoroughly anti-life.
Yeah, yeah,
That's the pro, because nihilism, it, it doesn't have to be anti-life. It can just be, well, it kind of is actually, isn't it? Because
it's
nihilism is
that's kind
death.
of the underpinning.
It kind of has to be, really.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I saw quite a good meme the other day, which was nihilists' lives don't matter.
That's hilarious. Well, one thing I mean, we might go off track here, but it doesn't matter. But to me, but that I've observed is that the make the world a better place spirit, if you want to call it, and it could say social justice warrior, but that's a big, loaded term. But this ideology now that's so prevalent, liberal progressivism, and this is very much what Vice Kings is about. To me, that's the friendly face of nihilism.
Mm.
That they're very compatible. That's why Temple of Satan it attracts all these the liberal. There's this convergence between Satanism and liberal progressivism that so compatible, surprisingly.
Yeah, one of the strangest things is seeing all of these, human rights movements being infiltrated by nihilism and now communism. And like, if you look at communism and the underpinnings of that, it's very much anti-human rights. Like, they are not pro-gay and they are not pro-free thought at all.
Hmm. Yeah, well, I think it's. I mean, I think because my sense with the nihilism and the whatever we're going to call this, to make the world a better placeism. Uh, it's like nature abhors a vacuum, and
So, like, if you remove religion, it has to be filled with something.
yes, like if you remove the possibility of something transcendental and something beyond this life and beyond our own personal, you know, pleasures and satisfactions, of course, hedonism and nihilism are very compatible also.
Mm.
Then you just get this sort of proliferating ideological hydra that's got all these different tentacles, and as you're saying, there might be two that seem that they're opposites, they're not compatible at all, but then enough time passes and they become bedfellows. and yet they can't really. They're going to end up fighting and killing each other in the end, because that's what you're saying. I mean, they agree up to a point, but then they'll get to some minutiae, and then it's, so I think there's just this, I think we're in this kind of identity warfare. So identity politics, of course, is the, you know, I don't know about the root of it, but it's when this whatever it is started becoming really visible and tangible, is this idea of identity politics. And so it's all about, it's not even human rights, it's about rights of the identity, which is the homunculus behind the eyes, this fictional self that's
Yeah.
completely isolated. You know, every man and woman is an island, and you've got to fortify your island, protect it at all rights. And so yeah, it just doesn't lead anywhere except to chaos and madness.